And given that we're discussing storytelling today, we want to begin by asking more about your stories. We just, from the previous panel, talked about how academics are part of communities and belonging to. So to particularize it, we're not just telling other people's stories, but we have our own stories. We wanted to ask you um, about what particular stories do you tell? And then how did you come to hear those stories and tell those stories yourself? Maybe we can start with you, Hannah. I think on your website you say migration is your thing. So I'd love to hear more about your story. Why is that your thing?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's funny, a lot of people ask me this question, and I don't have a super satisfying answer, but I'll sort of talk around it, and hopefully that's interesting. So, in studying migration, I work on sort of two major topics and with two, I think, major constituencies and sort of types of communities. So, I have a historical realm of research where I try to put together archival data, mostly that haven't been used before, in hopes of telling stories about communities that haven't been present in quantitative data to date. So, in particular, I focus on historical Chinese immigrants in the United States. And I also develop methodological techniques to be able to create panel data, longitudinal data to track people over time in these quantitative data sets that may not have been able to be linked before, and therefore highlight some of these experiences that may have been sort of hidden or excluded from our predominant analyses and theories of immigrant assimilation and the effects of immigration policies. I also work on migration and development, in which case I do a lot of surveys in the developing world, particularly in Latin America and in Africa. And there I find it really important to highlight the importance of migration for many of these communities in terms of economic development and how it shapes families as well as broader communities. And so to really get to the personal level in terms of the effects that migration can have. I think one thing I find really fascinating about this topic is how it sort of merges very high level, international level policy with like the extremely individual, like why somebody might move in hopes of improving lives for themselves and for their families. And so that's one thing that's really attracted me to studying this. And I guess one part of my story that I think has sort of translated into my research. Following up on the Middlebury shout out, I studied Chinese in undergrad at Middlebury and spent a summer interning at the Chinese consulate, a US consulate in China, literally fingerprinting people and stamping visas for people who wanted to come to the US. And then I spent a year in Zambia studying Chinese migration there, which had been sort of the crux of an anti-Chinese presidential campaign that was successful. And from those two things, I sort of started putting together the ways in which different countries and individuals have responded to Chinese migration across time and space. And I was really struck by the ways that a lot of these narratives could literally be cut and pasted from the 1880s in California to 2015 in Zambia. And so that's been one thing that's really sort of gave rise to this historical Chinese research and is something that I try to measure and sort of assess the impacts of through various data sets and perspectives.
Thanks, Hannah, for sharing that kind of like bigger stories and how you find yourself inside of a bigger story, and how that informs what you're doing now. I want to ask you too, Miguel. I remember when we met the first time, you were sharing about the joy of being drawn into the stories of the communities that had involved you in their stories. So I want to hear about your story and how you became involved in the stories that you tell in here.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. And it has been a beautiful morning listening to all these people working with this collective spirit of sharing the stories of communities. I'm really moved about it. But let's start as a storyteller, right? Once upon a time, there was a boy that grew up in a convoluted country, right? I'm from Colombia, South America, uh, a country that has been plagued by violence and corruption, and plagued by political corruption, by military insurgency, by mafia. Uh, and that found in the student movement a way to mobilize others like himself to call for a change. And that change is based on something that in Latin America we call la investigación de acción participativa, like research, action, and participation. It's a method of investigation that collapses ethnographic research with community-based transformation about social and political realities, and is based on reflection, participation, and collaboration. Right? It's a democratic and transparent process that combines theory and praxis, that has a reflexive and critical read of the historic and social conditions of communities, that is focused on collective action, and is also a way to create dialogue across several divides. Then, as a student, in the late 1980s in Colombia, we were able to pursue something that we called La Séptima Papeleta, the seventh movement. It was called the seventh ballot movement. It was to introduce during the presidential campaign of 1990 a referendum to reformat the national constitution that was not performing well. I mean, we were in a country in violence, a country that in 1989 killed 4 of their presidential candidates, and that needed to be reformed. Then students went out and we created this student movement. I participated actively on that. I was studying law at the time. And we were able to introduce this ballot, and the ballot went into the elections of 1990, and eventually it won, and a constitution rewriting started. Colombia has a new constitution since late 1991 that was a collaborative and participatory project. It was completely transformational. Then realizing that working with communities from below and connecting spaces of the academia with political action was a possibility, then the whole thing changed my life. Then after the constitution was accepted, right, through a second referendum, the task ahead was to implement the new constitution. Then, as a university student, I was doing my career. I exit law school because I found that was complicated, and I jump into anthropology, and then into the visual arts and philosophy and history. And I started working on participatory policy development. Basically was to travel through many of the territories of my country to be part of workshops in which we were asking communities of interest about particular things that have to be implemented in the Constitution. I work on 2 dimensions, on the draft for a law of culture and a draft for a law of the environment. And that's why when I graduated in the mid-1990s, I ended entering into the civil service, let's say, and help in the creation of what is today the Ministry of Culture in Colombia, and the possibility of building a participatory policy for the cultural sector. That's like the short version of why I do collaborative community-based work.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Miguel and Hannah. And I feel like that's going to richly inform how we hear your reflections on storytelling. And I hope others can see already what a rich gift it is to have each of these folks here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of us here in the conference share this desire to go and tell stories that are not being told. I think both of you do that in different ways. You've mentioned your work with Chinese records, Hannah, and I think now you are working with Italian surnames as well. Could you tell us a bit more about how working here and realizing what kind of information is preserved and what information is missing, how does that shape your vision of how to tell a story?
Yeah, thanks. So this is really complicated and I'm still thinking about it. I don't have final answers to it. So if anybody has input, I'm very, very open to it. I think I'll address this in a couple of different ways. So one one perspective here is that in terms of my work with Chinese immigrants, I'm working with a community that's not my own. And so I may have different perspectives, even those that I'm not aware of, maybe particularly those that I'm not aware of. And even when I attempt to do, um, unbiased quantitative research, we all know the ways in which our own perspectives and including the ways that we prepare and use data can seep into that. Um, and so one thing I've been particularly thinking about is I've been working to digitize all the immigration, emigration, and mortality statistics for Chinese immigrants under Chinese exclusion from 1880. I've collected through 1900 and proposing to collect through 1950 to measure all of the effects of changing immigration restrictions on the Chinese American population. And so these are stories that really haven't been told before in a quantitative way. Of course, historians and American studies scholars and many others have done incredible work telling very deep, rich stories, trying to highlight individual experiences and get deep into many of the just a lot of the things that had happened under those restrictive laws. But we really don't have is sort of numbers to back that up or to understand sort of how applicable some of those individual cases are to the broader population. And so what I've really been trying to do is collect all of these data to really tell some of these stories in the aggregate, how people responded to immigration restrictions in terms of occupational choice, in terms of returning home to China and other decisions that they make. So one challenge with these data is that Chinese voices are really not represented in most US archives. And most of these archival sources are registers of immigration and emigration and were collected with a purpose of surveillance or policing of this population. And so they may carry their own sort of bias. And so one thing I've really been struggling with or just thinking about is how to, on the one hand, take advantage of these incredible data that are available that can allow us to tell stories about a population in a way that no one has done before, while still balancing the fact that they're incredibly biased in the way that they're not collected by or really informed by the population that they're dealing with. And that this population, by virtue of being excluded from the country, has sort of been erased from telling stories themselves about what happened during that time period. And so that's something I just sort of continue to work with and continue to think about ways to sort of balance using any sources that might be told with the own voices of the people whose stories are aggregated in these data while highlighting the insights that we can reach from these data sources that haven't yet been used.
Right, fascinating. I think you're right. The sources themselves might be biased. Even if you have quantitative data, that doesn't mean the story is completely neutral. Miguel, I think you have a very beautiful example in this book, Territorio Encarnado, where you start an introduction saying, this text authorship is not unique, but communal. And that's probably a very good way of illustrating how you in your work try to put forth the voice of the community and not just your voice of the researchers. Could you tell us a bit more about that particular example?
Sure, sure. Thank you for looking into that. I think that one of the big problems in storytelling is that there is a main narrative, right? It's the narrative of that we understand as knowledge, let's say. And let's go back to what Professor Cathy was talking about, right? Is what we consider as the result of historical processes to understand as science or as history or as medicine, right? There's a consensus in the Western world about what are those areas of speciality and knowledge. And in the process that I had been taken, I think that there is this illusion that knowledge that is being presented to us through stats or data simulation or graphs or modeling creates this totality of the narrative, right? And we tend to agree with that, right? Because it's based on methods of obtaining this data and analyzing this data and presenting this data. Then we don't see many times the gaps in the data. What Anna was telling, right? I mean, there is data. The data is not aggregated. Can we trust this data or not? In my case, for example, working on developing cultural policy back in the 1990s, we realized that the nation had to rethink itself as a nation that was centralized, that recognized one main story, one main narrative, the narrative of the white people that conquered the nation, that populated the lands by force or not by force or by negotiation, etc., by tensions, and then many voices were silenced. The Constitution, and this was not only a process in Colombia, it was a process that was also taking place in Brazil and Mexico, and later in the early 2000s in Bolivia and Ecuador and Peru, right? Constitutional changes that expanded the understanding of citizenship. Who is member of a particular territory? Colombia, as a matter of fact, has 115 indigenous nations living within the nation, more than 64 indigenous languages that were not considered as languages in the nation, right? Then how do you give a voice to those other narratives, these sub-registers, right? And in the understanding of the community that you are dealing with, right? Because at the end, everything ends in policy, right? The policy will designate, an amount of money that will be invested into communities to quote unquote develop or bring progress or introduce them into, certain, benefits of being members of that society. Then what I found in my experience is that knowledge is not only what is printed in a piece of paper through ink and then move into archives that then will be processed and reread and reanalyzed. But it's something that is imprinted in the bodies of the people. Then this idea of embodiment, that knowledge is an embodied process. That is, nothing too radical, right? Storytelling is connected to the oral tradition, and we are, as human societies, built on that oral tradition that then was moved into a printed world, right? The solid archive, right? But there are many communities that are still within that tradition of orality and embeddedness within the landscape in which they live, embodiment within the environment and a relationship with that. Then how do you bring that complexity of understanding these communities in those locations in relationship with the forces that are trying to shape them, introduce them, or read them, right? Then this idea of embodiment comes and is being developed. There is not only my book, there are many books working on this and in many disciplines. And I can give you just one example of how we can do this. For example, I can just show you a short video, if you allow me, a 2-minute video of how we can try to translate this embodied knowledge that can tell us here outside of that space something that a community in particular is having, right? Is experiencing. Let's see if I can do that sharing easily here. Make sure that sound is going to be also. Hopefully, sound is going to be. Yeah, you have to tell me if sound will come.
Can't hear it at the moment, Miguel.
I think we don't have sound.
Okay, let's leave it there. This is from the Yanomami people. These are people that live in the Amazon basin between Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia. That means that this is a transnational community. And their ontology, their cosmovision, that is shared through storytelling every night from the elders to the rest of the community, is about how, by what they do in the everyday life, they are holding the sky for everybody in the world, right? Holding the sky literally, talking about how the natural systems that take place in the Amazon, this natural systems in which the weather, right, the river, the underground water, and the weather up there is maintained thanks to their practices in their territory, and their territory is being under siege, right? Then how to translate that knowledge that is part of a cosmovision, on an ontological vision of the world, in another language that is passed through generations through oral means, an embodiment of being there, right, for us, to us. Then this is an exercise on that process of storytelling.
Thank you, Miguel. I think that is a very powerful piece. And this is a great point about some native languages. In the Andean region, the Quechua family of languages is also oral in tradition. So there's not a lot of historical records because people don't write in Quechua, they just speak Quechua. So you're right that it's important to recognize all this orality of the transmission of information plays a role into what records are kept. Thank you. I think you had some more ideas.
Yeah, I want to ask another question, but I'm also just fascinated by this idea of like a meta story and each of you engaging with kind of in your example, Miguel, of like how do you rewrite a meta story? And I wonder, as people are joining this, thinking about community research, how each of you think about engaging with that story. I guess it gets into our second question a little bit about audience and thinking about I don't know if this, I guess we're speaking in images, but like also like if there's this story that your story will be swept into or interpreted through, how holding stories about historic Chinese exclusion or communities that have been left out of stories, how like how you think about curating stories, telling stories, hearing stories, when we're thinking about kind of issues of power and audience.
Anna?
That's a big question. I'm not
It's a huge,
sure
it's a
I
huge
have
question.
anything incredibly smart to say about that. I guess just first of all, I think it's important that I mean, I believe that academics as our job, it's not our job to curate stories. So in my world of data, that means making everything I do publicly available. So both the underlying sort of archival documents that haven't been public before this, as well as the processed data and the code to make sure that anybody can really use that and tell, whatever stories and find whatever conclusions they want to in there. So I think it is on some hand democratizing access because like I fundamentally don't think it's my role to sort of curate those stories, especially about a community that I'm not a part of. Um, I guess history always comes back around, right? So I think we saw during COVID a large rise in sort of anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Asian violence, much of it which echoed um, slurs and threats that had been used in the past. I think for some people that was surprising because often nowadays, we think of many Asian immigrants as being highly achieving, some of them as sort of a threat to native-born whites. And so I do think in that way, bringing some of these stories around and making sure not to scrub these past histories of exclusion or discrimination from our interpretation of modern day outcomes, because of course that's still very real and very present. These laws that were in force, 200 years ago still affect communities today, both in their lived experience and in how we interpret that. And so I think, yeah, taking a longer term view, I think is always helpful and appropriate. And I was going to say something else, but now I forget. So I'll turn it to Miguel, and if I think of it, I'll hop in again.
Yeah, I think that the tuning of the story is really important. I've been teaching for 7 years already a course called Narrating Nature: Documentaries for Environmental Studies, on the precise issue of narrating what is complex, right? Storytelling of the complexity of the world we live in, right? And that's why I appreciate a lot the panels that precede us because of their interest on environmental justice and ways to look at this complexity from the bottom up, right? Then is how to bridge, for example, all the science on climatology or climate change, and how to bring that closer to an audience, right? And why is this important? Because as the example I was showing about the Yanomami, that is a translation, is a cultural translation, right, in English, right, with mostly resources that we can get our hands on, right, on this side of the world. there are other challenges, and the challenges are not only about communities that don't speak the languages of command, colonial languages, whatever they are, Portuguese, Spanish, English, or Mandarin, as a matter of fact. But what about the non-human elements, right? Or the natural spaces and the forces of nature that don't have a way to be translated only via science, right? Let's say climatology or studies on extinction of species or etc., right? Is how to give voice to that doesn't have voice. Then there are many ways to do it, right? One thing is that we have to understand the science that is behind that, and then try to challenge that science to bring that science into another space. Then what I do in the class is that we try to understand a particular problem with the students. We go deep into what this problem is and what are the potential solutions, if there are any, and how we give voice to that problem in particular. Then we look really closely, for example, to the reports of the IPCC, that they come every 4 or 5 years, and they are coming, drop by drop. It's like the consensus in science about a particular issue. And then how we can collaborate with other people that are interested in passing this information, this knowledge, into the larger audience. That means everybody, right? Of course, everybody is not everybody, because we are segmented by whatever continents and hours and whatever, right? Languages, etc. But we are able to collaborate. Then we have come up with a number of collaborations. I can share just one of those collaborations with Conservation International on a project called Nature is Speaking. And let me share you just one of those. This is, again, a 2-minute thing. Let's share this. Hopefully the sound is going to come right away.
I am the ocean. I'm water. I'm most of this planet. I shaped it. Every stream, every cloud, and every raindrop, it all comes back to me. One way or another, every living thing here needs me. I'm the source. I'm what they crawled out of. Humans, they're no different. I don't owe them a thing. I give, they take, but I can always take back. That's just the way it's always been. It's not their planet anyway. Never was, never will be. But humans, they take more than their share. They poison me, then they expect me to feed them. Well, it doesn't work that way. If humans want to exist in nature with me and off of me, I suggest they listen close. I'm only going to say this once. If nature isn't kept healthy, humans won't survive. Simple as that. I could give a damn with or without humans. I'm the ocean. I covered this entire planet once, and I can always cover it again. That's all I have to say.
That's another example. We have been working with Conservation International on a series of short films on how to give voice to that doesn't have voice, right? I don't know if you recognize the voice of the ocean. Anybody recognize the voice?
The chat did.
Who was that? Harrison Ford.
Chewbacca's friend.
Then it's precisely that is the complexity of the moment we're living, Anthropocene or climate change or the great acceleration or whatever we want to call it in science, needs a way to reach the body of everybody, of us, to try to bring change, right? In research action, right? We have to mobilize, and we have to use what we have, right? And what is what we have in Western societies, right? We have societies that are divided between rich or poor, societies that are somehow collapsed by popular media, right? People are spending more time in certain spaces than in others, and we have to try to reach those kinds of spaces in ways and forms on that. And academia is a great space because we still have some sort of rapport, right? They respect us in academia more or less for what we do because of our supposedly neutrality. Of course, we are under attack now. But there is some respect, and then there can be some collaboration. That communities are not only the community base in which you are doing work, the Yanomami or the Latino community in Durham, North Carolina, or the migrant communities, diaspora communities of East Asia in the United States. But we are members of communities at large. And then there are positionalities and temporalities. So it's the spatialization and the temporalization of what we want to tell is relevant. Then we have to tune that kind of thing in narration. And that's what we're trying to do in this class. Actually, I invited everybody because we're going to show 5 years of short films produced by Duke students during Earth Month. In China, at DKU, and here in Durham in April. And their work is just amazing.
I'm hearing you, Miguel, talk about this moment of storytelling, which I think coming into this panel, I was thinking of that as like a something taking form, like, oh, I have to pick what form to tell this story in. But I'm hearing you say that it actually is something which is embodied, and then you're trying to like expand that embodiment or like help people to embody a story. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, if we were talking in class yesterday about extinctions, the sixth extinction, right? And then we were checking a documentary by the BBC called Extinction the Facts, right? And we were checking two short films and 2 long films. One of those is Albatross. It's a wonderful film by a photographer, a friend of mine, Chris Jordan, and another film about pangolins in East Asia. And students were saying, yes, of course, the data that the BBC documentary, conventional documentary, quite pedagogical and full of data and, with great budget, right? They go to several places in the world and they interview, scientists and whatever. It was good, but was very dry, right? It's something that we can read in a paper, right? Or in an article in Nature or in Science or in the New York Times or whatever. While the film that was produced about the pangolin was produced with former poachers in the border between Laos and Thailand, poachers of this little species, pangolins, and was developed as a pedagogical tool to tell the poachers that they were just one aspect of a full, system of extraction of this species that, an exotic kind of use of this species into traditional medicine in China, and exotic foods and meats, in high-end restaurants in Hong Kong. Then it was a short film, but it was made with the people in location about what they do and trying to connect the side that they don't see. And then that was very effective. It's a short film, low budget, community-based. The actors, the reenactments were, former poachers, people that understand the thing, trying to connect all their dots. Then it created an emotional attachment to the issue of the species of this little animal that we had been taken out of its space and taking it up to the brink of extinction, right? Then emotion is relevant, and I think we are all moved by emotional stories. And if one of those stories can just try to bring change, then great. We need the science, of course. We need to know what is going on behind and trying to connect all the dots. But emotion is important. Embodiment is important.
I appreciate that. And we'll invite questions. Please keep putting your questions in the chat. I want to also invite Hannah and Miguel, if you have questions for each other. This is a conversation, so I think we can open up to that as well. I see one of the questions in the chat from Dr. Kati is about the tension between orality, embodiment, and written forms of communication, and those kind of being considered superior in the dominant discourse around written, quantified, big data, concrete. So I want to pose that. It's posed to you, Miguel, so I want to offer that to you, but I would like to hear your response to that too, Hannah, in engaging narratives that are propagated in the dominant form as well, and how to engage with them there. So let's start with you, Miguel, around that question.
No, thank you for that question. I think we have been working a lot on that. There are like two ways to take into this question, right? Knowledge. And the idea of the coloniality of knowledge, right? Connecting with Professor Kati's development. Let me give you one example. An elder Nonuya informant for botanical research in the Caquetá region in Colombia, his name is Mohage Wiyu. He said once in an invitation we brought him to Duke University to talk about these issues, said that the only way for him to speak about his knowledge of the jungle, and this guy is known among scientists in the botanical space in Latin America and beyond, as the notary of plants, is a person that can identify 1,500 individual tree species in the region where he is, and close to 2,000 arboreal short shrubs in his territory. And he can name them in 3 different indigenous languages and in Spanish, because he's a polyglot, because indigenous nations have many languages and they move across. On top of that, he not only is the notary of plants, as they call him, but he understands the relationships these plants have with the creatures that inhabit those different trees and things. And he says the only way for him to speak about that knowledge is by ingesting the coca leaf. The coca leaf is an indigenous plant of the Amazon. It's not of the Andean range, it's from the Amazon, and is known by indigenous peoples in the Amazon as the tongue of the forest. That by ingesting this plant, right, you fix the knowledge of the forest and you are able to speak it. Just to think about knowledge, right? How do we fix knowledge in Western societies vis-a-vis the ingestion of a plant that will allow you to speak the knowledge of the forest, right? Leaves and ink, right? And we need paper that comes from plants and ink that is also a natural product that will be, inscribed into a paper and put somewhere and create, a bunch of paper, book, whatever, archive. While here we have another way to produce or to uh, interact with knowledge, right? It's a knowledge that is alive, that is a knowledge that is relational, is a knowledge that is not specialized in one aspect of the in this case botanical knowledge, not only naming plants, but the relationship these plants have with different species, right? Reptiles, insects, mammals, fish, as a matter of fact. And there are now research being done in the Amazon basin with entomologists, with people working in insects or people working in fish, or biologists, with local indigenous peoples that can allow them to look in a more complex way the relationships that things are taking place. Why? Because science is able to go and collect, right? Our herbariums, right? We have herbariums, beautiful herbariums, but the herbarium only takes one sample in one moment of the development of the plant, right? And don't talk about the different processes and relationships that plant has, right? While if you have the possibility of looking a more, relational way, more expanded, way, science that works in these vacuums suddenly starts to become more, I don't know, holistic. And I think that's a really good way to look at. Thanks to Mojave Wiyu.
Appreciate that. You're reminding me of like walking around this zoo that's right next to my parents' house and seeing like a giraffe covered in snow, and like then a timber wolf, which is native to that area, and thinking like, I don't think I'm learning the things that I'm supposed to learn about these animals and their relationship to each other. But I feel like that image of an arboreum is helpful even as an image of academia sometimes. I see we have another question.
Yeah, we have a question for Hannah. It's kind of a long question, but it's about your thoughts on the potential tension between striving for objectivity in quant research and the reality that we are all engaged in one way or another in storytelling with our findings. Hannah, your work has done important work countering common sense meta-narratives by showing how historical narratives of Chinatowns in the US are often wrong, or how rising economic development can counterintuitively drive more migration from lower income countries. Do you ever feel a tension in your work between the scientific value of objectivity in quant work and that subjectivity and/or inevitable choices that come into data analysis and storytelling, particularly around migration?
The short answer is all the time. I think being in a policy school, and I haven't talked that much about this, but not in the same very cool ways that Miguel is trying to translate some of his findings. But in terms of trying to understand what would resonate for different audiences, whether that's constituencies of politicians or community groups or people in the executive or in the congressional branches, trying to understand what elements of stories to tell and in what sort of way would resonate with those groups. I'm always, terrified that by conducting what I consider to be sort of a best practices data analysis, that I'll come up with some findings that run contrary to maybe my values or the policy recommendations that I would want to provide. That's definitely true. I've been somewhat lucky in the sense that hasn't been the case to date. And I'm pretty sure that didn't come from any sort of selective data analysis or anything like that. But that's always on my mind, and I've always been thinking about, particularly, if I study the effectiveness of immigration restrictions, I would be quite scared to come to the conclusion that yes, they work and they're not expensive and people should implement them if they want to stop immigration. Like that's not something that I personally believe in or would want to recommend to people in power. And so, I would have to think very carefully about how I wouldn't want to conceal that or hide that from people who are in the positions of power, but at the same time, think about perhaps what to emphasize and what not to for these different audiences. But yes, that's a tension I think I feel all the time. And just a sidebar, it's interesting. I think I also want to talk about sort of a meta thing that happens in academia, which is about incentives, right? So I had this idea I found these incredible photographs of Chinese immigrants in the archives that were really taken for their passport photos. There's actually a fascinating narrative about how more accessible photography was actually developed so that they could take photos of Chinese immigrants for passports. Like it was actually developed and popularized in terms of the speed of processing and the cost of doing it, because the immigration offices needed to be able to take these photos of people to tell them apart in their immigration files. And so that's like the history, underlies the history of popular photography in the world, actually. And so I found these stunning, gorgeous photographs in the archives, and I really want to do sort of a public-facing exhibition with them, compared maybe, or like side by side, maybe with some modern day portraits of descendants of people affected by exclusion, because I just think, as Miguel was alluding to, there's ways that we feel emotion, and often that's not through dry papers and things like that. But the incentives are such for me that that's very hard to do. I think academics, particularly those in maybe more traditional social science or science disciplines, it's very hard to find the time to do things like that are considered sort of extracurricular in terms of tenure or promotion or anything like that. And so, I have to admit that project, even though I've had the idea for a couple of years, it slipped off my desk in terms of, wanting to finish my dissertation and trying to get a job and things like that. And it's not that I don't think it's important, it's that these forms of storytelling or reaching different audiences are not considered as worthwhile in the academic environment, at least for some disciplines, as writing a paper and getting it in a top journal or something like that. And, I think that's something that I would hope that we see change, because not everyone, people learn differently, people take information in differently. And I think our goal as academics is to share our findings as broadly as possible, particularly when it pertains to policy and things that that affect people's real lives. But I just wanted to note that as sort of I think a meta factor that may inhibit more diverse forms of storytelling in certain fields.
No, thank you. I think that's an excellent point. I was hoping we would get to that at some point. The incentives that are along tenure track position, I think most cases are very aligned with doing what people have been doing for years, and they are not rewarding these new ways and probably more fair ways of storytelling. And we could probably get and talk about what do you think we can do about that? We have a couple of other questions also. I guess one little thing is that we are here trying to disseminate these ideas about how to involve communities in research and publication. I think it's a different process to then make these ideas part of the academic structures that are in place. And that might take a longer time. But you mentioned the different audiences and how that impacts the narratives that we carry. I think, Justin, you had a question about that? Or do we want to?
Yeah, I think, let's see, we have a few minutes left. I do want to highlight a couple of things that were dropped in the chat.
Okay.
Because I know a lot of people here are here to learn about how to tell stories. And so we got a couple. I see Darla Deirdre dropped UNESCO link about racial healing circles, and looks like there's an opportunity maybe to do a full day training on storytelling in And then I see from Irene Felsman also Story Center. So if others have, I don't know what the Newest Americans link is, but if others have kind of ways that people can begin to learn this. Miguel, you mentioned your class. I don't know how open that is to the students and things, but highlighting ways that I wonder if we could end in that spirit of kind of highlighting ways that people can begin to learn. Like you said, like I'll be thinking about fixing, stories and what kinds of plants are involved in that. But I think these processes of learning and developing imagination around what storytelling can mean. I wonder if we could just spend a little time there thinking of everyone attending here as a learner of some kind of new stories, if each of you would share something about that.
Yeah, this kind of work, the work that everybody is sharing, has been sharing today, it takes a long time, and is not only time consuming, but it's also emotionally consuming, right? We really need to create literacy about the ways we work with communities in participation, right? To try to bridge those gaps of information that are created when we work with communities, to be able also to have real prior informed consent and agreement by all the communities we work with, in order for them to being really well represented in the work we do. And I'm saying this because for some time now, for more than 5 years, I've been working with another project on environmental justice with Wayuu indigenous communities in the Guajira region in Colombia, which are a ground zero of the energy transition in Colombia. And many people are talking about just energy transitions, and it's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in China, everywhere. Why? Because every time we need to extract a resource from the earth that will benefit society, in this case, our dependence on electricity, energy, that is connected to natural resources, water or coal or gas or petroleum, or in this case, in Guajira, wind, we don't think about the location and the effects of that extraction on communities. Then, for 5 years, a group of scholars, me among them, actually my wife too, have been following a number of cases of the processes of prior consultation to communities in the becoming of this, the capturing of this energy, in this case wind. Then we don't think wind is something that has a right. It has a value. We have calculated a value on the wind that the Guajira Peninsula can bring to the net energy need in a country like Colombia in the middle of energy transition, right? A place, because of its location in the northern tip of Latin America, where all the hurricanes are formed in front of the Caribbean, has lots of energy potential, right? It's close to 15 gigawatts of potential energy production in an hourly basis. But that implies the development of huge infrastructure projects in a region that has been marginalized historically. It doesn't have roads, or actually is not interconnected into the electric system of Colombia, doesn't have running water, doesn't have hospitals or schools, but now is a prime place for the energy transition. How we can bring the dimension of justice, again, to connect what Colleen was saying and Professor Cathy and many others during the day. How we have to think about justice. right? Or what is just in general terms. Then the first thing is you have to go and listen to the communities. You have to go and spend time, invest many times your own resources, because the universities don't have enough, or we cannot write a grant for a kind of approach to a community. Listen to them, create these relationships, try to understand what are their needs, try to share some of the comparative approaches in terms of the impacts that are going to be taking place on that. And suddenly something clicked, right? And Toni Morrison, the famous US writer of the South, says, and I quote, "Narratives are radical, creating us at the very moment they are being created," end quote. Is the fact that we at academia sometimes we need the distance, the prudence of the distance, right? This idea of a positivist approach to a subject of study. It has to be isolated. We cannot have a relationship with it. We have to be no passion and no relationship, right? Because if that happens, then it's spoiled, right? Our sample will be spoiled. But actually, it doesn't make any sense to think in those ways. Yes, maybe on certain issues, if you're doing certain kind of research, you need a lab, you need a particular kind of location and way to do it. But when you're working with communities, you are right there at the moment of the creation, right? And narrative is a radical way. When a French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, will say that radical fabulations is the moment in which the people are able to write their own history. When the people write their own history, right, there is a radical understanding of life as it is. It's not being written by them, right? It's the moment of the revolution, let's say. Then if you think in those terms, you have to invest time. Then, for example, with this just energy transitions, we already have one PhD working with us. She graduated early in May last year. We have one master's student working with us. We have an undergraduate that graduated now with a fellowship, working and living in location. Then we have been creating reports, papers, participating in conferences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are doing our work as scholars on this part, right? Yes, we're doing it. It's our audience, right? We have to produce knowledge. We have to do all the protocols of interacting with human subjects. We have to go do the surveys. We have to yes, we do that. But at the same time, we have to allow these people to speak. Then we are now in the process of, everything's in a stall, right? These mega projects, these transitions, that has to happen because we are crashing the planet, are going to affect communities, in this case, indigenous Wayuu communities, in a very terrible manner, right? Then we have to give them the voice. Now that they know us for 4 or 5 years, that we have been there, that actually we had people living with them, we are now being able to start translating what they think for themselves and then for us. And let's think about that a community is not homogeneous, that there is heterogeneity always in a community. There is human communities have tensions, there are problems. There's politics, there is interest, there is, and again, and that's for the gap of the data, right? We tend to create homogeneity when we look at the data. We cannot have noise. Yes, we can have we can create, some sorts of controls in things when we do statistical work. But actually, that doesn't really make sense when you're really working within a community, right? It is complex, and then you have to create this translation of this. And we are now moving into that. We'll see what happens. Maybe we can show you something in the next 6 months of what we're doing with this community. But yeah, it's a lot of investment in time and in treasure and emotions. And we hope to come up with something that is valuable for them.
Thank you. Do we want to follow up with something, or should I?
Go for it. Yeah, Hannah, looks like you have something else to say.
Oh,
We did have more time.
Yeah,
We're
I
running
was
up against time, so
we
go
have
yeah, I
like
was just gonna offer two like quick thoughts or just sort of things to ponder in terms of moving this forward. I think the more traditional social science maybe fields are not as advanced as some of these projects that Miguel has been describing, but just two things I think that are relatively incremental, but I think yet could have a huge difference on various topics we've discussed. The first is, most grad students, for example, spend up to 2 years doing training in research methods and statistics. So what would it look like to take even half of a semester and dedicate it to alternative forms of storytelling? And how might that encourage people to share their research findings in different ways and with different audiences? So that's one thing. And then I think also, what would it look like if you're doing a survey on a particular research community or a study of a different form? What would it look like to have the requirement or the dedication to share your findings in some way with the community in some way that's impactful, whether that is through directly engaging with your respondents, whether that's through communicating your findings with community leaders, whatever form might be most appropriate. How would your research change, or how would your communication of these findings change if that was sort of a necessary and inherent part of your research process? So those are just two things I would put out there.
Thank you, and I think that's valuable. Yeah, maybe we can have another of this conference for people that are in a position to make those changes. But I wanted to just ask the question that was posted in the chat about how do you guys, both of you, engage with social media, and whether you see that as something that's flexible and can be helpful for storytelling, or whether the spread of misinformation is a problem for your work. What are the ways that you both harness forms of social media and attempt to disengage or engage with it in different ways? Thank you for scrolling.
I do not engage with social media.
Okay.
I think it's a wild place. We're going to try with my class for the first time to be proactive in the social media space by producing reviews of materials that we believe are relevant for informing about this complexity of anthropogenic climate change by basically reviewing films that we believe are relevant, and then we'll deploy them through social media as this subgenre of shorts, but with content. We'll try that for the first time this semester, but I have many problems with that space. Third nature, we call it. And the idea is to reconnect that third nature, that third space, this virtual nature, back to the origin, back to nature, right? As everything, all these technologies we have are coming from, mining processes, extracting processes, labor extraction, economic systems. We have to try to reconnect that. And if we can give some content on that, I hope something will happen. Otherwise, I don't deal with it.
I'll say I've backed off substantially. I used to see social media as, a useful tool to be able to communicate research findings more broadly, perhaps break them down into simpler ways of communicating it than regression tables and things like that. Something that could, perhaps be more digestible and informative for policymakers. I think I no longer believe that to be true. I think in the last 8 years or plus, we've seen that just evidence in general is not trusted or is in fact disparaged, and misinformation can be more attractive and more compelling. And so I have substantially reduced my social media use, both for my own mental health and because I think the benefits I used to see in it may no longer be as strongly present.